the last 50 years, what's happened to our manufacturing industry, our heavy industries in this country? I mean, it's been decimated. They've all been offshore through low-wage economies. It's an absolute outrage. And the sixth biggest economy in the world, around 15 million people are living in poverty.
The whole agenda, if you go back to Pinochet and what he did in Chile, it comes from the Chicago Business School. It's the shock doctrine. And more people are beginning to realize that their governments and the corporations are criminal. They're going to poison us with vaccines and spraying us with chemicals. Immigration has been used as a weapon of war for millennia. When you inject, I don't know, a large proportion of military-aged men into an environment, you fund them, you keep them in hotels, designed to actually create this division.
Well, not as cynical as Clive is. It's not relevant when you consider that there are, 14 to 15 million people living in poverty in this country, and that is a direct consequence of political decision.
Hello and welcome to the Deep Dive Perspective. Our topic today is the budget. Britain is going through a period of real economic woe. Starmer hasn't really arrested any of the free fall that Britain is in economically, and it's of course showing up in the figures as well. And it seems as though we're about to be subjected to a budget, an autumn budget, which is going to really hit people hard, exactly where Starmer said he wasn't going to hit people. That's the taxes. What's actually going on? Does this government have a real vision of how to rescue Britain? Why is it still continuing with the forever wars and then pleading poverty at home? There are so many questions about the way the British government is handling the economy. And on the ground, of course, people are suffering. Food banks are growing. There are all sorts of problems that are really causing poverty on a level that hasn't been seen for a very, very long time in this country. In amongst it all, of course, we've got them going gung-ho on the immigration issue. And this week we're seeing lots of new policies that have come out, which are going to be even more draconian on asylum seekers and immigrants as a whole. These and other questions we're going to hopefully unravel. And I couldn't have two better guests in the studio to give us a really very interesting insight into all this. First of all, welcome to the show, Chris Williamson.
Thank you.
Former Labour Party MP and also currently the Deputy Leader of the Workers' Party of Britain. Also, welcome to the show, Clive Menzies, who currently is the founder of the outersite.org site, if I've got that right, but also Critical Thinking was your baby, and a kind of an alternative analysis, a contextual analysis of politics is usually where I find Clive very, very interesting. And I guess I'm going to start with you, Chris. Let's start with how you feel this government has done so far, and what do you think this budget holds? Where are they going with this?
Well, there used to be a line in Morecambe and Wise where Eric Morecambe would say, "What do you think of it so far?" And he'd say, "Rubbish." And basically, that's what I think about the first, 18 months of this so-called Labour government. They're not really a Labour government at all. They are imposing austerity. They are delivering a neoliberal economic agenda. And none of this is necessary. Rachel Reeves, the Chancellor, talks about an alleged financial black hole in the public finances. It's complete fantasy land. The government issues the currency. It can never run out of money. The focus should not be on finding the money. Taxes do not fund government expenditure. When the government wants to spend, they just issue an order to the Bank of England, and they provide the resources for that. The focus should be on identifying real resources in the economy. Have we got the workforce? Have we got the machinery and all the rest of it? To be able to deliver the things that can actually, that can create a good society. So I think she needs to abandon the fiscal rules, which commit the government to balancing the budget, basically, in other words, matching expenditure to the amount that they're raising in tax revenue. I mean, it's a ridiculous proposition, totally unnecessary. And the only people that are benefiting from the economic agenda which is being pursued by this government at the moment are the faceless corporations and the super rich, wealthy oligarchs. And I think we should have a a government that actually represents the people and use the power of the state to intervene in the economy to make sure that it works for the many, not the few.
Well, she keeps blaming the previous government. That's the standard ploy of any establishment that comes in and has a mess to clear up. They spend the first 4 years saying, "Oh, we're doing what we're doing because the guys who came before us were so bad." But does that wash?
It doesn't wash at all. I mean, and they're following the same economic agenda as the previous administration and the one before that and the one before that. I mean, we've been following this neoliberal agenda really since Margaret Thatcher came to power. Indeed, even before that, actually, when Dennis Healey in 1976 went to the International Monetary Fund on a false premise on the basis that somehow Britain was running out of money. I mean, Britain has been a floating fiat currency ever since 1971 when Richard Nixon jettisoned the Bretton Woods Agreement, which linked the dollar to gold and other currencies like pound sterling was linked to the value of the dollar. So since that time, as I say, it's just been a floating fiat currency, and that gives enormous flexibility, therefore, to the government to use that in order to intervene in the economy, to create a good society. Look, over the last 50 years, what's happened to our manufacturing industry, our heavy industries in this country? I mean, it's been decimated. They've all been offshored to low-wage economies, and a lot of people, like Alistair Campbell, I saw him the other day talking about, the important thing is to look at potentially rejoining the European Union. And the biggest problem that is afflicting Britain today is Brexit. Well, that's not true at all. I mean, the way Brexit's been handled, certainly. But the key thing is the economic agenda being pursued by this particular government and the one before it. So that doesn't wash that it's all the fault of the previous administration. As I say, they're following exactly the same neoliberal economic orthodoxy as the previous outfit. So, I mean, what we need is well, in a way, a kind of return to Keynesianism, and that demonstrated, didn't it, at the end of the Second World War, when Britain was genuinely sort of in a very difficult place economically. The so-called debt to GDP ratio, although government debt's not really debt, it's the issuing of bonds, so it's selling bonds to, into the market, was around 250%. And yet they created the National Health Service, welfare state, built 1 million homes, and actually set in train a system which lasted until the mid-1970s, where a bigger and bigger proportion every single year was going to workers in their wage packets. Economic inequality was narrowing all the time. Working class people could aspire to buy their own homes. There was plentiful, actually, public housing available then. There were many jobs that were in the manufacturing sector and across the piece, the public sector and the rest, that were secure jobs which provided good wages, good pension, and gave people that security. That's kind of gone now for the vast majority of people in this country. Millions of people are in precarious employment, millions are in low-wage jobs, millions of people, around 15 million people, are living in poverty in the sixth biggest economy in the world. It's an absolute outrage. And what we should be doing, what Rachel Reeves should be doing, is saying we're going to set in train an economic agenda that's going to eradicate poverty by the end of this Parliament, that's going to start to renew our infrastructure, that's going to kick the privateers out of our public health services and stop our public services being used as a cash cow for privatising spivs. To renationalise the National Health Service and reorder that in a way. It's not just about simply throwing more money at the National Health Service, because if we did that without restructuring it, lots of that money would be being siphoned off to private healthcare providers. So we need to reorder all of that sort of stuff, bring the utilities back into public ownership, stop them ripping off consumers, stop them pumping raw sewage into our rivers and seas. So, the blueprint's there. It can be done. This is not pie in the sky. But, when you're taking your orders from the city, from Wall Street, from the likes of BlackRock, when you're claiming that our salvation, the way to kind of grow the economy, is to cozy up to the private sector and rely on these vulture capitalists, essentially, to grow the economy, well, I mean, that's just a recipe for disaster. That isn't going to, assist and benefit the vast majority of the people in this country. This, it's basically a return to, well, not a return to, a continuation of so-called trickle-down economics.
So, Clive, I'm going to bring you in on this. Chris has set out his stall and made a very strong case for why this government is failing. I was watching a short video just last night, and there was an assertion that actually this cycle that hypercapitalism or capitalism has is almost systemically organized. That this is the way it's meant to be, the boom and bust. And the fact is that eventually they just go and do the same thing over and over again. And it's usually the people who are closest to the source of money that get the least, not just the least impact or detrimental impact, but actually they profit. It's the guys at the end of the chain, the ones who are just the wage earners and who are just basically consuming and producing. They're the ones who suffer. The guys who are closer to where the action is, they actually profit from these ups and downs, and it's because they seem to know how to manipulate money. You've made a big deal about money and about the ignorance of our society about economics and particularly about money. How do you fit Chris's narrative within what your research tells us?
Okay. What came to my mind when you were talking about those closest to the source of money benefit the most and those furthest away suffer the most? It's like a chain letter. That's how our money system works. That basically it's a chain letter where the people who start the chain letter and at the beginning of it, if enough people at the bottom of the pyramid play the game, then they win. But when you run out of people, the game's over. So we've been in a system. This is what we're talking about is a millennial transformation. We cannot escape from the current predicament by looking in the rearview mirror. We're entering a brand new paradigm. So the way debt accumulates, and you say it's planned, to some extent it's inevitable and structural, but yes, it is also manipulated and controlled. And there are many, many examples. So effectively, contrary to what Chris asserts, the government doesn't issue money. It borrows money from the Bank of England, which is part of the global banking cartel. And the government, taxpayers, are obliged to pay interest. So the money is created. It doesn't exist. They don't go knock on the door, as Chris said. They create the money. But the government is creating the money with its agreement to repay it. But the interest is never created, and yet more interest is demanded. And so what happens is that you get to a point where the system is no longer sensible, sustainable, like the chain letter. Nobody's playing anymore, and the whole thing collapses. So that's the systemic element. But there was an article written in the Rolling Stone by Matt Taibbi in 2014-ish called The Great Bubble Machine. And it was talking about Goldman Sachs. But although it talked about Goldman Sachs is just one manifestation of the banking system. And it shows how they create booms and busts. They created a boom in the 60s in the post-war era, and then collapsed the economy later when there happened to be a Labour government. And so we have these constant cycles. We should have had a collapse in 2008. Bondholders should have lost money. The criminals should have been expelled from the system. But no. They came out with the Vickers report, which is unintelligible word salad, and the criminals are still in charge. The problems of imbalances of debt in the economy, in the economic system, the global economic system, is now such that it's worse than in 2008, and when it pops. This is why they talk about the Great Reset. But the whole agenda, if you go back to Pinochet, and what he did in Chile, it comes from the Chicago Business School. It's the shock doctrine. Margaret Thatcher didn't apply it in the way that she would have liked to, but Pinochet did it at the barrel of a gun, and many people died. So this is what the world is being subjected to. You will own nothing and you will be happy. Basically, you're going to rent everything. So there's no opportunity to be self-sufficient. That is the plan, but it's falling apart, which is why everything is in such chaos at the moment. So what the UK government does is irrelevant, because they are controlled like every other government is controlled to a greater or lesser extent. And I would say that the UK government, the US government, the European Union are more controlled than, say, China, Russia, whatever. But they are controlled, but to a lesser extent. So the cult, if you like, that is running this theatre is in a position now where it's no longer in control. The structure that has evolved with all the vectors of control, politics, NGOs, media, religion, identity, social media, all of these levers that it's inserted itself into, nobody's actually controlling this anymore. The structure is driving, through the incentive and penalty mechanism, people to do what they do. So weapons manufacturers make wars. The intelligence services work for the banking system primarily, so they're promoting the agenda, which is basically to create chaos in order to have a reset where everything is controlled, we're all surveilled, greatly reduced population. That's been the plan for decades. But it's now falling apart because the techniques that they use, first and foremost, the idea that one computer system can rule us all is, having worked in technology and built systems or been involved in the building of systems, that, they're all flawed. Look at the 34 billion NHS tracking system that never performed. Most of the money probably disappeared into people's pockets. So, and because they're using dark, sinister techniques such as satanic ritual abuse that flows down through the millennia, they're using techniques that are extremely potent, powerful, but they are woefully inadequate if they're used for selfish purposes, because good will, or love will, always triumph over evil. And more people are beginning to realize that their governments and the corporations are criminal. They've been poisoning us with vaccines and spraying us with chemicals and creating a bogus climate narrative and all the other things that they've done. People are becoming aware of this. So to some extent, this political theatre is concerning less and less people. They're taking less and less notice. They're finding ways of detaching from the system, not paying their council tax, not paying taxes, not paying debt. Basically, you borrow money, you created the money. It's your signature that created the money. Why is it that you have to repay what you've created? I mean, we've organized ourselves with money for the last 2,500, 3,000 years. And now we're at the sort of hyper state of monetization where basically everything is monetized.
Okay.
And it cannot be sustained. And what it's being replaced by is the tools and technology and the knowledge that has multiplied our capacity to process, absorb, capture, analyze, and use information by a factor of millions or even a billion, whereas the Industrial Revolution, which lasted 200 years, multiplied our ability to make stuff by a magnitude in the order of hundreds. This is the magnitude of the transition that makes this rather irrelevant, the sort of minutiae of what this politician's saying or planning to do, and the solutions from the past are not going to apply in the new paradigm.
Well, it's a very hopeful analysis, although it's covered a lot of different ground, which we probably won't be able to cover in this session. But Chris, you're more concerned with the nuts and bolts on the coal face of how politics works and how economics works. I mean, decisions that are made in Parliament, of course, they go through these processes of discussion. There's the backroom workings. You've seen all that. You've been part of it as well. And what Clive's saying is that doesn't matter. But to the ordinary public, that's all they see. They see Rachel Reeves, they see that she's going to put the taxes up, it's going to impact how much their mortgage is going to be, or how much they're going to have to pay out, and what groceries they have. That's where they are. They barely, I think most people understand economics of a basic kind, let alone understand this kind of context of the global politics or the process of economics over centuries. Try and make sense of this. And if there's things that you want to take up that Clive said,
yes, well, I think there's a conspiracy in the media to keep people ignorant about the way the system works in that sense, and that suits the neoliberal establishment. If people don't understand the workings or become very cynical, and quite rightly, I think people are cynical about the political process at the moment, because basically they are all the same. They're all singing from the same hymn sheet in that sense. And so, that old saying, don't vote, because the government gets in, I think is apposite. But I think if you give people a reason to participate, and we saw that, didn't we, in Scotland was it 2014 when the referendum, Scottish independence referendum? I mean, there was massive turnout there. I mean, people really were engaged with that. I think in some areas there was a kind of turnout of around 90-odd%. So I'm not as cynical as Clive is about, or indeed agree with what he says that it's all irrelevant. It's not irrelevant when you consider that there are, 14 or 15 million people living in poverty in this country, and that is a direct consequence of political decisions. And yes, I mean, I agree with the point that Clive made about the military-industrial complex, but then, that's always been the case. I mean, Smedley Butler, I think he was a 4-star general in the US Army, wrote a book, I think it was in 1935, where he talked about his time. The name of the book is more of a pamphlet, really, rather than a book, called War is a Racket. And he talked then about how, essentially, he never did any good. He was just a muscle man for Wall Street. So ever it was thus, Eisenhower, didn't he? In fact, he coined the term military-industrial complex in his valedictory speech just before JFK took over as president, and warned about the overweening power of the military-industrial complex. I mean, his concerns, I think, were not taken on. I think Kennedy was keen to do so, but then obviously he got assassinated, and the rest is history, as they say. Clive's wrong when he talks about, government, having to borrow money. They do not borrow money. When you talk about borrowing money from the Bank of England, who owns the Bank of England? The government owns the Bank of England. And so, to suggest that it's like taking money out of your right pocket and giving it to your left pocket and saying that your left pocket's borrowed money from your right pocket. It's the same entity at the end of the day. And this notion of borrowing, I mean, what we have in this country is a situation where if the tax revenues don't match a government expenditure, they call that the deficit, and they plug that so-called deficit with bond sales, which they call borrowing. But they don't have to do that because, as I've said, they're in control of the currency. They can create the currency. The issue isn't the availability of money. The issue is, as I've already said, the availability of real resources in the economy. Have we got the plant, machinery, the workers, etc., to actually deliver the good society? And that's where I think the focus should be. Taxation is necessary to keep a lid on inflation, because if it's too much money, then it's swirling around in the economy. You create shortages and you create inflationary pressure. So I'm not suggesting you simply create money willy-nilly and then everything will be fine and dandy. Of course it won't. But you use taxation judiciously to bear down on inflation. And I think it's also important to use it to address economic inequality in this country, to really go after the very wealthy with various tax measures. Certainly, the most one that people are talking about at the moment is the wealth tax. And people say, well, will they leave the country? Well, it doesn't really matter, because we don't need the billionaires to deliver a good society. And frankly, I don't think they would leave in any event, actually. But even if they did, it wouldn't matter, because, the vast bulk of people are still here. The government has access to the monetary, they issue the currency, as I say. And that's what I think, the focus should be on. And I think, they peddle this myth about taxation, because that then creates the illusion that somehow the creation of good society is beyond reach. It's unaffordable. As Tony Benn used to say, if we can find the money to kill people, we can find the money to help people. Money's never an issue, is it? Even with this government. I mean, they're throwing money at NATO's proxy war in Ukraine, aren't they? And there's never a problem. There's never a shortage of money for war. You don't see generals collecting on the street corner for the latest missile, do you?
No.
Unlike in the National Health Service, where we do have charitable donations to try and supplement the inadequate facilities available in the National Health Service.
Just turning to what you think Reeves is going to do. I mean, of course, in this budget, this business of tax cutting, of course, they're reneging on yet another promise. I mean, they've done several of those actions. Do you think it really makes any sense? Is there an alternative to this?
Yes, I mean, I've been setting out that alternative, and it would be catastrophic to increase the basic rate of income tax. I mean, Reeves keeps talking about she wants to generate economic growth. If you start increasing the basic tax rate, that's going to have a negative impact on economic growth because you're going to reduce aggregate demand in the economy. However, if you tax the very wealthy, that won't have a negative effect because the wealthy, most of the money that the wealthy have is not spent, they hoard it. But you put money in the pockets of ordinary working people, they'll tend to spend it more regularly and more freely than the very super rich will. So that I think would be a disastrous. And again, it comes back to the point where they won't take up the ability that they have at their disposal, or the powers that they have at their disposal to intervene in the economy, to intervene in a way because they've got these fiscal powers. And we've seen it done in the past. It's not like we're talking some sort of fantasy here. We've seen it done. 1945, and indeed, even Conservative governments actually continued with the post-war consensus.
The Bradbury Pound. And all that.
Well, the Bradbury Pound goes back further. That was the First World War scenario, wasn't it? But I mean, I'm talking post-Second World War. I mean, Harold Macmillan, when he was a housing spokesperson for the 1951 general election, was talking about how the Conservatives were going to build 300,000 homes a year, and I think they just about achieved that. But as I say, our infrastructure's falling to pieces. We've got utilities, the water companies pumping raw sewage into our rivers and seas and profiteering from the charges which they're imposing. Same with the gas and the electricity. Similarly with the...
and their profit is going exponentially higher.
Yes, exactly. I mean, it's an absurdity. And, we need to be bringing these utilities, the bare minimum, really, we need to be bringing these utilities back into public ownership. Frankly, I think if we were to just simply reassert the situation that we had when I was growing up in the 1960s and early 1970s, where the utilities and these basic things were provided by the state, where we had a thriving manufacturing industry, where we didn't put all our eggs in the financial services basket, where we gave hope to people, we provided housing for people. I mean, I think that would actually motivate interest. It would stimulate participation. I think we should have a big municipalisation.
And so these policies, I know the Workers' Party of Britain pretty much are putting these policies out. And in the last election, clearly, not only did the mainstream media not give any coverage to your party, but they continue not to do that.
No, indeed. Yeah.
And they promote those parties, and these days, of course, the Green Party is being feted and being given a promotion. But actually, the fundamental economic policies of all of these parties seem pretty much the same. Clive?
Well, just before you go, just very briefly, in terms of the Green Party, what I will say is with Zach Polanski, he is the only leader that understands how the monetary system operates.
Right.
And he's talking sense about the way in which the economy works. And so that's a real positive step. And if only, Rachel Reeves would take a leaf out of his book in terms of, the ability that she has at her disposal to make a real difference for people, then that really would, I think, make a quality.
We'll go into a little bit more of what he's saying. Clive, anything you want to come back on what Chris was saying around the economy? I am going to move to one other area as well, because it's very, very close to people's nerves, if you like. It's a raw nerve, that of immigration and asylum. It's one which really does stir the people and is being utilised by reform, of course, initially, and it's being utilised by everybody from Tel Aviv, Tommy Robinson, through to, of course, Mr. Starmer himself now. They're all on this bandwagon. Shabana Mahmood is milking it to try and win back votes, basically out Farage, perhaps, arguably. But we'll come on to that perhaps after you've responded to anything on the economy, some concluding remarks around the economic woes of Britain.
Right, okay. First of all, Bank of England, two things. One is it's probably not even owned by the British government. It has the appearance of being owned by the British government. But nonetheless, even if we accepted that it was under ownership, that doesn't mean to say it's under control. It's under control of the Bank of International Settlements, which is a private institution run by the banking families. So, the Bank of England is no more serving our interests than our military is serving our interests or our intelligence services.
It could be, though. It could be. Political will.
The NHS, I would say, has always been an sickness and disability industry. It was conceived as a health care institution, but it was very quickly captured by Big Pharma and slid down the road to conventional medicine. It was Tony Blair that turned doctors into businessmen. Before they were just salaried employees and would do their best. But we've now, what is being dispensed by the NHS is largely toxic in terms of drugs. Whether you're talking about antibiotics, whether you're talking about vaccines specifically, which are killing people. It's now coming out in the mainstream that the vaccines kill. It's the notion that we can return to this rather rosy spectacled vision of the 70s. I remember it very well. I had a manufacturing company. I was making furniture. But it was characterized, that period was characterized by a huge number of obstacles which at the time seemed onerous, but they were infinitesimal compared to what we experience today in enterprise. You really wanted to talk about immigration. I think that must be seen in the global context because everything has some sort of purpose or multi-purposes. Immigration has been used as a weapon of war for millennia, and there has been a concerted effort to destroy the fabric of European culture, individual European culture. I mean, Chris mentioned Scots voting for independence, and then they promptly were shepherded into the European Union, an unelected body. So going from minimal control over Westminster, they've gone into no control in the EU. So, there are so many narratives that people have bought into that have put them in this situation. And there is a new narrative which is emerging. So the immigrants aren't our enemy, but they've been funded, incentivized, and trafficked into this country to cause civil unrest, disruption, pressure on services, and to create this division between the indigenous population and the immigrants. And in my experience, immigration has been going on a long time. I have relationships with people all around the world. This is not about race, culture, identity, or anything like that. It's about how do you preserve some sort of stability in a situation when you inject, a large proportion of military-aged men into an environment, you fund them, you keep them in hotels, you give them more money than you're giving pensioners by a factor of, I don't know what the multiple is. I think pensioners get something like 9,000 a year. They're getting 29,000 a year. So that this is regarded as being unfair. But it's designed to actually create this division, and hence the appeal of the characters you mentioned. But we need to be getting away from gathering around institutional ideas and actually talk amongst ourselves as communities, as families, as people who come into contact with each other. And we now have the technology to do that globally. And this is where we're heading. So whilst I agree that there's huge poverty, all of that's being prescribed isn't going to work, not because it couldn't work, but because it's never worked in the past, because there are sufficient powers or incentives within the structure to destroy anything good. That's basic. I mean, basically, there are two forces in the world at the moment. They're competing forces. the force of fear of not having enough, fear of the other, fear of whatever it may be, and love. That's in essence what we're talking about. You can dress it up in economic speak, you can dress it up in geopolitics, but that's what we're talking about. And we live within a system which is diametrically opposed to the fundamental principle of the universe, which is love. All we need to do is change the rules of the game, and they are changing. They're changing on the big platforms like Google, Apple, Facebook, the ones that we revile. They can't help themselves. They're socializing our problems and socializing our solutions, which means that we don't need institutions. Most of us have enough trouble governing ourselves. What makes us think that any one individual is capable of governing a whole community?
Well, I'll come on to how that works, because that puts a whole thought of destroying institutions and changing. I mean,
not destroying, replacing.
Replacing. Well, I'm a revolutionary at heart, to be honest, and I'd quite like the idea of ripping apart some of these bad institutions
you don't need,
as well.
Just withdraw your energy.
Well, okay, withdrawal consent. So, Chris, there's some interesting ideas that Clive is firing there, but on immigration specifically, the government has been talking about it a lot, and they've just come out with this raft of policies. I saw you sort of shaking your head at one point where Chris was, where Clive was giving a particular set of statistics around.
Yeah, I mean, I think in terms of like getting, asylum seekers getting more money than pensioners. I mean, that's just factually not true. But I do think that, I mean, this is another feature, mass immigration, not so much necessarily the illegal immigration. It is another feature, isn't it, of the kind of neoliberal agenda. They want a kind of reserve army of cheap labour that can actually help to drive down wages. And what we saw is a perfect storm when Thatcher came into office and built on the changes that were brought in by Jim Callaghan's administration after Denis Healey, as I've said, went to the International Monetary Fund in 1976. So as well as those kind of economic reforms, we saw the attacks on the trade union movement. And Dennis Skinner used to give a great anecdote. He said after the Second World War, when he was working down the pit, he made the point that, there were lots of immigrant workers there were lots of Poles and Lithuanians and all the rest of it. And he said, but there weren't any issues of racism or anything like that. He said, because everybody was in the union, there was no employment agencies anywhere in sight, and everybody got the rate for the job. And so this kind of division, if you like, didn't really exist in that sense. And that's the sort of society that I think we should get back to. But the people that are that are playing on this lowest common denominator and dividing people and saying it's all othering migrants in that sense are a bunch of hypocrites at the end of the day, because all of them support the policies which are driving migration flows, including Reform UK. They support the economic sanctions on countries with despotic regimes, which creates desperation in
what about wars, perhaps?
Well, I was just going to say, so you've got economic sanctions, you've got arms sales. Well, I don't say to just despotic regimes, economic sanctions on countries they disagree with, arms sales to despotic regimes, which are then used to suppress their population, and of course wars as well. I mean, and Julian Assange made the point, didn't he, about the forever war? He was talking about the situation in Afghanistan at the time. This was before he sought refuge in the Ecuadorian embassy. So it's going back a while ago, and it's when the intervention in Afghanistan was at its height. And he said, it's not about winning the war in Afghanistan. This is about creating a forever war to wash public money through the killing fields of Afghanistan and back into the coffers of the military-industrial complex, mainly in the United States, but certainly in Britain and Europe as well. And so going back to Smedley Butler, war is a racket. And that's what I think we should be doing. We should be exposing these frauds who are, using immigration as a stick in that sense. Let's acknowledge that, there are challenges created by immigration, but with the right system in place, so you could, you stop the exploitation of workers, and you create that kind of good society. So that it's more difficult. If everybody's kind of doing okay, they've got a reasonable standard of living, decent income, they can retire, they've got, to a reasonable age, with insecurity, got a decent home, and so on and so forth. The kids can go to university free of charge if they want to go to university. They can get a career. If people have got a good life like that, it's much more difficult then for the sort of far right extremists to sort of say blame people with a different colour skin, that it's all their fault. These people coming over. And if actually look at the numbers of people coming over on the boats, I mean. I mean, in the overall scheme of things, it's not a huge number of individuals. But there is an issue as well as one of the points that I've made just in terms of the impact that it has on the economy here, and the use of the capitalist class, if you like, to suppress wages, is that it's often the brightest and the best which are leaving developing nations in that sense, and so that's denuding them of real talent. So, what I want to see, is creation of a good society in this country, improving our economy, our economic well-being of everybody, etc., and looking to trade with some of these countries so we can help them to build their own economies up and enable people, to have a good life in their own country, because it's a pretty dramatic step to take, isn't it? To leave all that including the kind of people who are taking the extreme step of paying these people smugglers and then risking their lives in small boats to cross the English Channel. It's a massive step to take, to leave everything that to do that, or indeed people to come through legal means as well.
Well, the thing is, it seems like a no-brainer to me that, again, you talk about these neoliberals and I talk about the transnational corporations, because every time I go to some of these big stores like Sainsbury's and Tesco's, there's a high proportion of immigrants that have been clearly legally imported because from India, from in different fields. I observe it. So clearly there's been an exercise of allowing corporations, perhaps even certain state sector outfits as well, to bring in these chaps. And then when they're here, then of course, it's not necessarily just all immigration, because Donald Trump didn't mind the South Africans coming in, but ICE is going after all the others that tend to be of Latino background or of color. Yeah. So there's an element of this kind of racism, which clearly seems to be there within the Trump and his style of doing it, and whether it'll be there within Mr. Starmer's version of ICE and whatever. I don't think it is pretty clear there's a racist element going on, isn't it? I mean, they were quite happy to bring potential Nazis in from Ukraine rather than actually, using their good officers to stop NATO's proxy war in Ukraine. That they were welcomed with open arms, weren't they? But people, the notion that people from Palestine could come, or people from other war-torn areas, and basically because they have a different colour skin. That's an absolute disgrace. So I'll let you come back on that. We haven't got much time left. It's literally the last word for both of you on it. Anything you want to come back on that we've said over the last few minutes, but also just maybe a vision for the future, because you start talking about love and that's going to solve problems, and a lot of people listening, they won't quite get it, because I understand the spiritual dimension, and I understand that people have more to them than just the mechanics of politics and economics, but the reality is that also there are many people out there who are confused, scared, anxious, and really also still following exactly what the diktat is. They're still complying. So how do you see this shaping up over the next sort of, say, 4 or 5 years?
Well, I'm not in the business of making predictions, but looking at the trajectory, we can see what's unfolding. I would like to talk about the military-industrial complex. We, in our analysis, refer to the military intelligence media academic complex, because they're all working in tandem or together. And in fact, every institution works together. So it's far broader. The culprits in war aren't just the arms companies. They're supported by all these other control vectors.
Sure.
I suppose, as Chris was talking about, having a decent life, being able to get a good job and then retire, and everybody should have that. From the time I started this research in 2012, I had this growing feeling, and I wasn't at all spiritual in those days. I had this growing feeling that there is more to life. Is that what we're really here for? To get a job, a muck job in many cases, a job that has no meaning, no value to humanity as such, whether it be pushing paper or making weapons or poisoning people with industrial food. Is that really what we're here for? Muck jobs? I don't believe we are. My experience is that we're not. that we become truly fulfilled when we start connecting with reality. And economics is almost irrelevant to this, but for those who are plugged into the system, reliant on the system, and it's not serving them well, then they need to look to other means rather than looking to more from the system, because there's always a reciprocal more control. The more you take from the system, when you register anything, even your child, it becomes the property of the corporation, which is the UK. So it's about withdrawing where you can from the system and finding solutions for health, for food, for all the essentials in life around you, amongst your community. Far more difficult to do in the city, far more difficult to do if you're up the pyramid. But when you're down near the bottom of the pyramid and you have nowhere else to go, there is a new opportunity to emerging. There are thriving health groups, food groups, all sorts of groups to help you with these problems, to help insulate you from the worst that the bureaucratic nightmare has to offer. Most people live in a sort of parallel universe of The Trial by Kafka, where they have to jump through all these hoops and it doesn't make their life any better. Now there are routes emerging and the structure is adapting to people being able to help themselves and each other, because that's the fundamental way we get out of this. Love thy neighbour as thyself. Who is thy neighbour? Everyone. We're all connected. No one is independent from the structure, the universe. I have no religion. I don't refer to God, but God, Allah, Yahweh, whatever term you apply, we're all part of that, and therefore we're all connected.
Okay,
we resorted to money because we didn't have the technology. Now we do.
Chris, final word goes to you.
I mean, I think there's dignity in work, and they don't have to, people don't have to be sort of relegated to doing bullshit jobs. I mean, I take the point that, a lot of the employment is not rewarding, but there is lots of things that are very rewarding and necessary actually for a functioning society. Doctors, nurses, to look after us when we are unwell. I take your point about better primary care and making this a genuine sort of health service rather than a sickness service. But nevertheless, people will still get sick. People will still have accidents, and we need people to look after them when they do. We need people to kind of build shelter, homes, etc., the roads and vehicles and all the rest of it that we need. So there are things, and I think there is dignity in work, and giving people secure employment, I think, is, spiritually, they gain from that. And yes, it doesn't have to be all about, just dedicating your lives, to just being a wage slave. And I'm not saying that, people should be having to, as they very often are now, working all hours God sends. And I go back to what John Maynard Keynes said nearly 100 years ago when he talked about his children's generation, his grandchildren's generation, I beg your pardon, his grandchildren's generation, i.e. my generation, and yours probably, Clive.
Maybe.
Own up, Clive.
will only be working 15 hours a week because of the much of new technology, etc.
That makes him a clever person.
So I think that there is opportunities to enable people to have the dignity of work, to reduce the working week, to reduce the retirement age as well, but also to enable people to grow as human beings, to have the time to engage in art and literature and all the rest, or whatever else it is, and get back to nature and so on, to have the time to be able to do that. I take Clive's point when, if your focus is entirely nose to the grindstone, you've never got time, you get home from work, you're worn out, and you haven't got time for that. But I do think that, we could have a shorter working week. We could help people to grow. We could have a, better education system with free education, etc., to get rid of tuition fees and so on, and have basically a lifelong learning environment. And I'll keep quoting Tony Benn because so many great quotes, but he used to talk about raising the school leaving age to 75 because he believed in lifelong learning. And he said that a fortnight after he made that speech, he received a letter from an 85-year-old who said, "Why are you discriminating against me, Mr. Benn? I've just graduated from the Open University." So he said, "I've changed my position. Now there should be no upper age limit." But in order for you to be able to take advantage of that, you do need to look at the working time that people have to devote to their employment. I think it's not beyond the wit of this sort of highly advanced nation to be able to do that. We can create a good society. We can do it. And, politics is the mechanism to make that happen. And, the reason I think the status quo has been able to survive in the way that it has, the neoliberal status quo, is, as we were saying earlier on, because, people are kept in the dark, and the right wing and the rest of it, they play to the lowest common denominator. So one of my passions is to raise people's consciousness and to raise their expectations and to demand more, from this very wealthy and sophisticated economy and country, and I think if we did that, as I say, a good society is there for the taking.
Well, fascinating conversation. Thank you, Clive. And thank you, Chris, for a really invigorating look into what is happening and what should be happening. I can just really conclude by saying some of the comments around the Green Party and perhaps the Workers' Party, then of course this grassroots resistance to things that are not good for us now. There could be a marriage of the two. I think the two go together. People need to invest in better politics. But there's a quote by Imam Ali alayhi salam who says that to know the truth, or rather to know the people of truth, you need to know the truth first. And that means we've got to do a lot more work, a lot more literacy about both politics, about economics, about where these visions are. And the way to do that is to, I think, listen to a lot more of these kinds of discussions and people who have a vision and who have been working on the coalface of trying to create an alternative that is better for our country. It's not a question of just bemoaning and feeling hopeless. Things can change, although the system will try to prevent it. Nonetheless, the power does lie in the people. I'm with my colleagues on that one. So it's up to us to educate ourselves in a better way. More learned we are, the more we'll be able to understand where the actual truth is. So I think the effort starts with us at home. That's where we need to begin. Thank you for watching this edition of the Deep Dive Perspective. And don't forget to press that subscribe button. Please like and share the channel because we rely on you. Alternative media is being suppressed. We know that the mainstream doesn't like these kinds of narratives. If they did, they would be allowing the likes of the Workers' Party and others to have a fair crack of the whip even in politics, all the kind of ideas which Clive came up with, but they don't. And so we're living in an environment where we need to be able to educate ourselves and yourselves with more and more media like this. That's why Deep Dive Perspective needs your support. Thank you.